Adam is a senior researcher with the Cook Center, and Fenaba is a former DITE fellow and a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And recently, the Cook Center undertook a project in which we are writing a book that is soon to be published by Duke University Press on COVID-19. And today, Fenaba and Adam are going to present their chapter that is part of that anthology. So we're happy to have them continue to eat and continue to engage, and while we listen to this wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. Good morning, everyone. We are going to build in a few opportunities for you to talk with the people at your table. And so we want to just start by encouraging you to continue eating, continue having your coffee, and we're going to have a chance for you to talk to the people around you. So don't, please don't enter lecture recipient mode just yet this morning. You'll have more opportunities for that a little bit later today. So the COVID-19 project book that the members of the Cook Center have been working on has a series of chapters, and I've put the themes up on the slide. And today, Fenaba and I are going to talk specifically about housing, student debt, and labor market inequality. But I just want to show you a bit of the breadth of the work. And we are, essentially, each of the chapter teams set out to ask what forms of inequality were in place before the pandemic that impacted, of course, the onset of the pandemic, and then how has inequality mattered and been mirrored through the pandemic. There are a series of basic questions that each chapter was trying to ask, and I'll just read three of them. The first is, how have past and ongoing inequalities in this field made certain populations especially vulnerable to COVID-19? The second is, how does viewing the COVID-19 pandemic through this lens reflect both the frustrations felt by these populations and the shortcomings elsewhere in society that are contributing to this suffering? And third is, what remedies are needed in this area to alleviate inequities, both during future pandemics and in quote-unquote normal times? So each of the chapters attempts to address these. One of the things that we encountered when we set out to do this work, and this is not just our chapter, but many of the chapters, was that some of the questions we wanted to ask we couldn't ask in the same way that we would typically ask them. Some of the answers that we were looking for, we couldn't find in the same way that we would usually find our answers. And so those basic avenues to helpful information were often closed off. So what we want to do, I told you we were going to ask you to talk, so we're going to start really early. So I'm going to start you off with a table talk prompt. And what I would really like for you all to discuss at your tables, and if you're at a table with one or two and you need to join up, please do. But our first question is really, how did the subject and methods of your research change due to the pandemic? I'm making an assumption that everyone in this room identifies with that question. I think something really changed about the work that I do. So let's start by getting a few of those things out. And hopefully you'll find some common connections and common themes in the discussion that you have. So take a few minutes. We'll give you a little notice when we're going to come back together. Thanks.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the slide, what's just above the green is the slide. I think the other thing, yes. Well, maybe you don't. I think the setup, so the slide that follows is what we're just researching data, which I think you can just say. But I mean, the basic sort of financial review or something, part of it is not.
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna pull you back together. We're gonna draw you back to us. I'm gonna give the example and then I'll turn it over to you. Okay, we're gonna pull you back together. I know. I'm gonna start using my elementary school classroom tactics. Okay, so our original plan for this morning was to have you all share back to us. I understand the importance of staying on schedule, especially for the first session of the day. So we're going to stay on schedule. I want to give you just a brief example of what this subject and methods change looked like in some of the work that we're doing at the Cook Center. So we had a group that had received some funding from Duke through a program called Bass Connections to look at student health services. So almost overnight, in the span of about 2 weeks, every student who had access to on-campus student health lost access to that because campuses just closed. And so we wanted to do some research on who had lost access and what that access loss had looked like. But of course, we didn't want to overtax the schools that were already going through so much. And so we put together a team of students who did a website review. And this was November and December of 2020. So this was a while after the pandemic had started. And they reviewed about 250 college and university websites to see if those the student health websites for those colleges and universities had links to telemedicine access on their websites. And what we wanted to see was if students had been sent home from a campus, which was happening across the country, were campuses able to pivot to offer telemedicine access to those students? And the somewhere around 35 to 40% were able to provide telemedicine access, but of course that leaves a huge percentage of colleges and universities that weren't. And we saw some trends, things like larger universities were more likely to provide telemedicine access, more rural, smaller universities were less likely to provide, things like this, right? But I like that example because we were able to find a method that took a look at the question. Oh, louder, okay, louder. We were able to find a method that answered the question we were trying to ask, but without requiring anything extra of the universities or asking more of people who were already taxed in that particular situation. Okay, so now Fenaba is going to talk a little bit about the specifics of our chapter, and I'm going to hand it over to her.
Here we go. Good morning, everybody. So our chapter is focused on financial insecurity and financial vulnerability of particular Black households. And we split it up into pre-pandemic, like a pre-pandemic scape of what these households look like prior to the onset of COVID-19, and then what was happening during, or we could infer what might be happening due to their vulnerability prior to entering the crisis. So as wealth inequality scholars, we knew that prior to the pandemic, Black households had about 1/10 of the wealth of white households. They had higher rates of unemployment, and there was this home ownership gap. A lot of the research that I have done work in over the last few years has looked at the role of student loan debt disparities, in particular among young households. And interestingly, we saw a pretty quick policy response, in particular with regard to federal loans, with the kind of moratorium on having to pay student loan debt as a part of the CARES Act. So these kind of what were or what could have been some short-term policy responses in regard to especially our communities who were having to stay home and make choices with regard to not work or jeopardizing their own health if they chose to continue working, and we really try to lay out in the chapter this struggle, right? Because we have people who had to rely on earned income to pay their housing, to pay, to pay off debt, to not get evicted, and what it might mean if they entered into the labor market and compromised the health of themselves and their families. Right? And we also focus a lot on what we highlight Black women who had to make these choices, especially when schools shut down and they had to face crises of childcare and remove themselves from the labor market. And so, we have all these confounding factors that are happening in multiple markets at the same time, and how the underlying economic vulnerability within our household, within these households, within our households, it made it a really difficult choices for a lot of people, and in particular, when we see, as we saw, and we see from the data, the higher rates of COVID-19, both diagnosis and deaths within our communities. So that's kind of, I think that's a good overview. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, so our next question is with regard to, so one of the things we had to do in the projects was rely on data prior to the pandemic. There was a lot of people rushing to collect data as it was happening, but as we were trying to say something about who might be the most vulnerable, we really had to rely on data that was collected prior to the pandemic. And it's a little bit harder, especially with regards to questions around wealth accumulation. It takes some time. The Survey of Consumer Finance is the most recent wave, was in 2019, so it didn't really have information on those early months of 2020. So we're going to ask, what reliable or trustworthy sources of data have you found during the pandemic when so many traditional data collection methods were suspended? And I should say here that one of the fascinating things, especially being on social media, is learning about how people have collected data, what data they've collected, in trying to get a picture, paint a picture of what is happening in real time. So we'll just give you a few minutes, like 2 or 3, if anyone at your table has seen or collected on their own some interesting data. And I know there are people in the audience who are doing this, so that's why we're actually raising this question here today. So about 2 to 3 minutes, okay? Although I completed the previous now that I'm looking at the next one. That's all right. That's okay. But yeah. What we know about what's happening. Yeah, so do you want to do that before? I still want to set up this question.
Oh, I didn't mean to highlight for them.
Oh, highlight.
This one's really interesting.
Yeah.
So the CARES Act didn't, if your loan wasn't fairly backed, the CARES Act didn't help that much.
Oh, yeah.
Is it too hard to read if it's pink? Do you want to name some of the specifics about likelihood?
I think that's well, I mean,
It might be worth mentioning that the pandemic was sometimes referred to as like a first gender. Was it gender pandemic? Like a gender. You remember that phrase?
I know the Great Recession was like this. C-section. Now I'm getting confused.
I find this really interesting. Working mothers reduce their hours significantly more than working fathers. That doesn't, calling it a reduction of hours is not fair because that just reinforces
Alright, so did you highlight it?
yeah.
Wait.
You might just have to refresh it.
Yeah, I did it.
Well, I don't know if how interesting you found this, but black families were more likely to have multiple generations which increased the time between applications and benefits is much slower for black applicants in part because some states
Guys over there.
Right.
Okay, so
Yeah, just that's. I think there's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's only 4 pink.
come back. I'm sorry, I had my mask off that whole time. All right, everyone. We're going to continue and shift a little bit more to provide some what we do know, based on the data that was collected or has been collected over the last year. So, with regards to home ownership, we see that more than 6 in 10 Black adults with a 2019 household income of less than $35,000 reported losing labor income in 2020. We also see with regards to the CARES Act that was passed last March, it made borrowers with mortgage loans backed by the federal government eligible to pay for a forbearance period of up to 180 days if they experience financial hardship due to the pandemic. And federally backed home loans include those that are issued by the Federal Housing Administration, the Department of Veteran Affairs, and the Department of Agriculture, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. But roughly 30% of U.S. mortgages, which is close to 14.5 million loans, are held by privately and not federally backed, and Black homeowners in particular are more likely than white homeowners to hold subprime or predatory housing loans. Right? So, finding that space where, the policy is not really responsive to the people that may need the most assistance. I'm going to jump to I already mentioned in the previous part about the response to the student loans. We see with regard to the labor market, again, these stark gender dynamics with increased childcare needs due to the school closures, which prevented women from working or drove, dual earner households, especially heterosexual couples, to prioritize men's labor. And some work found that working mothers of young children reduced their work hours 4 to 5 times more than working fathers of young children during the first 3 months of the pandemic. And so, of course, to call it like a reduction of work hours is, we say, a misnomer, since those same working mothers are taking on a lot more, or I'd say take on a lot more of the child care and homeschooling at the expense of their paid work time. There's also a report that showed that more than 1 in 6 Black workers lost a job between February and April of 2020, and nearly 19% of Black women workers lost their job during that same window. So, just highlighting what happened. So I also wanted to highlight, before we move into the next question, these 3 buckets. As I've already mentioned, I have done work, or I continue to do work in the middle bucket on student debt. And last year, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, we also had an election, in which many of, if you remember, what was going on, which many of the Democratic candidates were using student debt and student loans to as part of their platforms, and had also, for good or for bad, for better or for worse, were highlighting the stark racial disparities in student loan debt and its relationship to racial wealth inequality, which is actually the work that myself and a lot of my co-authors have done. And so during the midst of this COVID pandemic, I was receiving a lot of attention and a lot of calls and a lot of information, and it was, it's not just me, because we also had during the midst of COVID a huge amount of police killings and social justice movements that were speak directly to a lot of the work that many of us in this room have researched, talk on, lived in our lives, and the layers of having to navigate both as an academic and wanting to be in a space when you want to be part of the conversation, at the same time when, on a personal level, you have to navigate childcare, having your child at home, multi-generational households, vulnerability around elder care, and just came to a head, personally for me in my life, in this very real way that I think as academics, you kind of wait for, oh yeah, like my work is being seen. It's I'm having this opportunity to say something, but it also coincided with this very this moment of a pandemic and wanting to also be cautious and be careful. And I talked to my students a lot last year about self-care and having to being in the right space. But also, how do we, as academics, take care of ourselves in this moment as well? So I say this to say that the pandemic, for many, the research is something that we do, but it's also what we live. And I think one of the overarching things that I want to highlight, especially about being a Black female scholar, is that a lot of the stuff I ask and the questions that I ask and answer are important to me, not just as a intellectual pursuit, but also because I've lived a lot of the questions and the things. In particular, starts with student debt, but above and beyond, a lot of the wealth inequality as well. So if you feel comfortable sharing with your neighbors or with the people at your table, how did you navigate heightened demands on personal labor, household labor, and professional labor in the past 18 months? So I'll give you guys a few. For some, there was no need to. There was not that many competing demands, but for many of us there were. So, if you want to take a few minutes to discuss that. I saw some heads nodding. Like I wasn't the only one, right? No, I just.
Okay, let's bring it back together. Let's bring it back together. So one thing I want to make sure I do is commend Mackenzie Olson's presentation during the breakout sessions later today on the effects of the 2020 social justice movement on faculty. Both Fenaba and I felt a great deal of resonance between that, the theme of that talk and the work of this project. So we just wanted to commend that as something that we're looking forward to. The other thing is I have good news, which is that we have a little time, which means we can open up the microphones. We don't have to worry about staying on schedule unless there's a little too much of the microphones, in which case we'll have to get back on schedule. But because we have a little time left in the morning session, I just want to open it up and say, with regard to any of the three questions that we asked about trustworthy and reliable data, or new interesting methods, or ways of managing the variety of things on your personal and professional plate, what came up at your table that you would like to share with us and with the room for sort of how you've navigated work and life and research over the last 18 months. So the microphones here and here should be working, and we invite you to share with us.
So I just really want to know from the rest of the audience, because I'm a health economist, and if you use any of those type of data to look at what's going on with health outcomes, basically starting from 2016 onward, your data is a mess because you have the opioid epidemic hockey sticking at this point. It's no longer linear, right? It is hockey sticking at this point. You have multiple confounders going on with PDMPs, Naloxone laws, medical marijuana laws, all those coming into effect, and then COVID comes. All right, I don't know how you get reliable inference for the next, starting from 2017 or so until 5 years into that. What do we do with that whole chunk of data that is now so contaminated with all these multiple policies, and particularly policies that were adopted along political lines? So don't tell me that they are not endogenous. Right? There's no parallel trends that's going to save you there. All right. I just look at that work and it just boggles the mind that we still see these papers come out saying, oh, causal effects. No, they're not causal. They can't be unless you're really controlling for everything underneath the moon along the way. So I would love to hear what data ideas you have. There are some, so 911 calls are one of those things. The absence of data is another one, and what I mean by that is, think about child neglect, child abuse. Those numbers went down. Why? Teachers weren't actually looking at these students coming in. So the fact that we saw them fall gives us some conservative estimates about what was potentially going on during this time period. But yeah, I would love to hear from the floor. What do we do?
Sandra told me to come share the research, and I guess this is partly a response to your question. Sure. So, because you mentioned what type of work, Belinda Archibong Barnard, you mentioned one of the questions we were discussing was what type of work have you been doing during COVID? So it turns out my work is on the economics of epidemics, and so I've been working on epidemics prior to 2020. And then, with COVID, we had a project already in the field. So I'm a development economist, so I do a lot of work in African countries. So we had a project in Ghana where we were using phone surveys actually to collect data. So what we noticed was like among poor households, you saw every category of spending going down, especially after lockdown in March in 2020, except one, and which was phone credits. So in the US, people have Verizon and phone plans, but if you go to other countries, people will buy like pay-as-you-go with phone credits, right? So what we said is like, wow, these are poor consumers. They have, they're kind of asset constrained, and yet one category that's going up is like they're purchasing phone credits. And what were they doing? People were trying to stay in touch with friends and family. So what we said is like, let's do a very low-cost RCT intervention where we issued like $7, very, very cheap, credits to these households. And we said like, let's monitor what's happening with like mental health. So this is how we did the phone surveys. Like, let's monitor what's happening in the household with like domestic violence. So we found really like economically significant improvements in mental well-being and also declines in domestic violence. So people were like, these like very, very cheap interventions they were using to stay in touch with friends and family. And this was really, really crucial in maintaining or improving mental health. So this is something that comes up with like, I don't know if there are people that are doing this research on, is ICT, should it be a public service? Should it be publicly subsidized, et cetera? And we thought like this is one way, like we do these like phone surveys, we collect the data on health, and this is like one, we thought like important piece of evidence for, yes, you should, like government should be subsidizing ICT, access to communication, access to the internet is super important, especially when you have these types of crises. And it's like very, very cheap to do. Anyway, so plug for my research. Sandra made me do it. And also,
I have a thought just in response to the question about what do we do about this data and if it's not, if we can't rely on it. And I think that this is a point in time where we as economists are going to have to rely a lot more on qualitative data. And we're going to have to not, get out from behind our data screens, and if we can't trust the numbers that are coming into us, either go out, collect qualitative data and talk to people, or at least start elevating the work of the people who do go out and talk to people so that we have a better understanding of maybe what's happening underneath the numbers we're seeing.
Until, as someone walks to the mic, I'll share one more anecdote, which is that it kind of speaks to the last question. Last summer, when this book was, we were supposed to be working on these articles, and I was completely overwhelmed and just, was having trouble. And I went to the editors, and I was just like, I just don't think I can pull this together. I was like, I have something to say. I started something. I have an outline. I don't really have, I just can't find the time right now. And they were like, oh, well, go speak to Adam, and see if he, because I think he had some, some thoughts around, especially like the higher ed piece. And so, we did this is a collaborative piece rooted in the fact that last summer was absolutely a mess, but also that, as I said, I had something that I wanted to say and a topic that I wanted to talk on, but just didn't know how I could feasibly make it happen. And so, I do a lot of collaborative work, and we do a lot of the folks in this room do a lot of collaborative work. But, just, in the spirit of kind of sharing out again how, we have to, come together and make make things work, but also in a very hard and troubling time. And so thank you, Adam, for helping me to complete the piece. But also, just wanted to share that story as well, as why we're here today. And I think it's, and I should say also, I think it's important and great to start the conference talking about what's going on. Because sometimes, you get in meetings and you get around folks and they just start talking about business that you start talking about, and I'm like, there's something in the room that is unaddressed, while we're here, do I need to turn my Zoom camera on right now? I'm not feeling it right now. I'm not turning on the camera because, I just don't want that window into my life right now. So I really appreciate, everyone, them allowing us to start the conference with the realities of what we're living with right now, which is the pandemic. Yes.
Hi, Linda Lubear, Morgan State University, doing sabbatical in a few days at Johns Hopkins. But the mental stress was something that I wanted to just share because, home life with a lot of things with my family and husband and everything just really kind of blew up at a time when you were isolated, and the mental stress was something, that I had to deal with. And what I just wanted to share that what happened for me, going through it, a group started at Morgan where they would start having meditations through Zoom, and that was my savior. That meditation, going within and just being able to take the pieces of everything then that I needed to do in a better light so that everything that had to be done was done. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Jason Goupay, NC State. One of the things that happened, I was in 2020, a working class black man was tortured and executed in the street in Minnesota, and somehow my service demands went through the roof as everybody got a conscious about what they hadn't been doing the last 10, 15, 20 years, and navigating that sort of added on top of all of everything else. So I just wanted to put that out there as folks thought about how the field changes going forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, I think continuation of that, I think we put a lot of checking boxes sometimes, and that added to the whole mental stress, the intrahousehold allocation of time. But I was going to say also that I think us, as DITE, as organizations, INEA and ASH, we may need to start to also have very close allies in the data production of administrative data, state level data, how things are being asked at the federal and more official data used by policymakers. I think our research is using them, but now we need to also go back and look how we also change some of the way this information is being collected and is being also reproduced by others. So I think that's a step that with COVID, we noticed that how some changes happen because they needed to happen, but that could have happened before COVID too, if we had more involvement in that section area. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else want to share or what was discussed at your table? Sorry. Sure, absolutely.
Hi, my name is Francisca Antman, and I'm at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm very happy to be here. And I'm also co-director of the mentoring program, as many of you have been through. I thank you very much. And I'm a DITE fellow from cohort 1. 2008. Anyway, all right, so that's my CV. But I am looking at evaluations for people who are coming up for tenure, and I'm sure people in this room are thinking about that. And I'm wondering, because so much of that experience of COVID is actually very personal, super, super micro. Like, you can't make assumptions about how people were affected. And actually, so at my university, they're talking about sort of, you have to sort of disclose more in order to sort of maybe get greater, recognition of the challenges you've faced, which I have some comfort issues with. I'm not sure how comfortable I am with all of that. But I'm wondering what other institutions are doing to sort of address that very personal. For some people, it may have, hit them much harder than other people. So I'm wondering if anyone has good suggestions.
We use the COVID statement. We have a COVID statement in your personnel document.
But that's sort of the thing that you have to make like a personal sort of declaration of how you were hit by it, right? Which I feel like is, I don't know that there's a better solution. We also have that, but it is, it requires you to disclose in ways that maybe, maybe threaten your kind of, or you feel not sure about, So I don't know if anybody else has any.
If anything, I think it's double-edged though, right? Because how could they hold that against you?
Right, yeah, that's the issue, yeah, that if you're disclose.
Mics, please.
Disclose that, yes, I was hit hard because I'm the personal caregiver for 4 children. I don't necessarily want to highlight that, in my record.
Hi, everyone. My name is Pani Unawan. I teach at Middlebury College. As the other colleague mentioned, when it came to reappointment, tenure, so forth and so on, what happened is economics department is one of the largest departments on campus, and all the junior faculty, and they were able to go talk to the administration. And then they said that the teaching evaluations, so forth, during the pandemic, whatever, are optional in the sense that they're not going to be part of the record. And then also they gave us a leeway of extending by a year that their tenure clock will not. So in that way, it really took away a lot of anxiety, because otherwise it was a very hard situation to be. So I don't know whether other universities followed something on those lines, but Middlebury did.
So we also have that similar, but obviously we all in this room know the literature also on, extensions to teaching clock for parental leave, for example, would be a good example on how that actually disadvantages women in a lot of situations, because it's just not an equal burden that is being shared. And I think COVID is sort of similar in the sense that I would expect it to exacerbate inequalities, but I don't know a way around it. Yeah, I don't know what else to do.
Okay, thank you. I think that's one of the beauties of being in this space, is that I'm sure you're not the only one who's raising those questions, and that not just your institution. So hopefully we can create a space over the next few days to kind of field these questions and share knowledge and information. So please do take the opportunity.
No, thank you all. I saw one of the breakfast carts wheeling that way. So if you're still hungry, maybe go now before the other breakfast cart wheels that way. But thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you.